C.S. Lewis, a renowned Christian author and theologian, often delves into the complex and profound nature of faith, suffering, and waiting. His works, such as The Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, and A Grief Observed, touch on these themes with great sensitivity and insight. When we turn to the topic of waiting, specifically waiting for God's intervention, C.S. Lewis offers a perspective that is both challenging and comforting, striking a balance between human longing and divine patience. To understand why God keeps us waiting, we must first explore the idea of time and God's relationship to it. Lewis, like many theologians, believed that God exists outside the constraints of time. For human beings, time is linear. We experience the past, the present, and the future in a sequential manner. But for God, all of time is present simultaneously. This idea is difficult for us to grasp, as it transcends our understanding. Lewis presents this in a way that invites us to reconsider our approach to waiting. We often wait in frustration or impatience, but from God's perspective, there is no such thing as delay. He is not bound by time as we are. Lewis draws a vivid analogy to explain this concept. Imagine a man looking at a parade from a high vantage point. While the people at the front of the parade are moving forward, the man sees the entire procession at once. In this way, God can see the beginning, middle, and end of our lives simultaneously. There is no rush for him, and therefore, no need for us to be in a rush either. One of the key reasons we might experience waiting in our spiritual lives is because God is shaping us. Waiting is not just about enduring a period of time. It is a transformative process. C.S. Lewis writes in his famous work, The Problem of Pain, that suffering and waiting are tools that God uses to refine our character. These periods of waiting are not punishments or signs of abandonment. Rather, they are times of spiritual formation. They allow us to grow in ways that instant gratification or immediate answers never could. Lewis also emphasizes the importance of patience in our relationship with God. Patience, for Lewis, is not a passive waiting. It is an active form of trust in God's plan. When we wait, we are not simply biding our time. We are cultivating a deeper trust in God's faithfulness, in His timing, and in His purposes. This waiting is a way for us to align our hearts with His will. In many of Lewis' writings, he stresses that God is not merely concerned with the final outcome, but also with the journey, with our growth along the way. Patience allows us to embrace that journey, to trust that God's timing is perfect, even when we cannot see the full picture. Another important insight Lewis offers about waiting is related to the idea of longing and desire. As human beings, we often long for things, love, success, healing, or answers to our prayers. These longings are not inherently wrong. In fact, they are a reflection of our deep, God-given desires. Lewis suggests that these desires are often the very things that point us to God. In his book, The Weight of Glory, he writes about how our deep yearnings for fulfillment and satisfaction are, in many ways, a longing for God Himself. The things we wait for in this world, whether it's a specific outcome or the resolution of a problem, are but shadows of the eternal fulfillment that only God can provide. However, Lewis also points out that our desires can become disordered. We may place our hope and faith in the wrong things, seeking fulfillment in transient and earthly pleasures. Waiting, in this sense, becomes a process of reordering our desires, teaching us to place our ultimate hope in God rather than in temporary solutions. Waiting becomes an opportunity to redirect our longings toward the eternal, to fix our eyes not on the fleeting things of this world, but on the unshakable promises of God. The act of waiting also forces us to confront our own limitations. In his book, Mere Christianity, Lewis speaks about the nature of humility and how it is intimately connected with our dependence on God. Waiting requires us to admit that we do not have control over our circumstances, that we are not in charge of the timing of our lives. This realization can be humbling, but it is also freeing. It frees us from the anxiety and stress of trying to control outcomes and allows us to trust in God's sovereignty. As we wait, we also learn to rely on God's grace. It is in the moments of waiting that we come face to face with our own weakness and insufficiency. It is precisely in these moments that God's grace becomes most apparent. Lewis often highlights the idea that grace is not earned or deserved, but freely given by God. In times of waiting, we are reminded that we do not need to earn God's favor or rush ahead of His plan. His grace is sufficient for us, even in the waiting. For Lewis, waiting is a key element in the spiritual discipline of surrender. It is an act of letting go of our own agendas and submitting to God's will. This is not to say that we passively resign ourselves to fate, but rather that we actively choose to trust God's good and perfect will for our lives. Waiting, then, becomes an exercise in surrendering our will and desires to God, knowing that His plan is always better than our own. In addition to the personal transformation that occurs during periods of waiting, Lewis also points out the communal aspect of waiting. He emphasizes the importance of patience in our relationships with others. In his reflections on human nature, Lewis recognizes that we all experience different forms of waiting, whether it's waiting for healing, for answers, or for reconciliation. Our shared experience of waiting can lead us to a deeper empathy and understanding of others. It also reminds us that we are not alone in our struggles, and that God's timing is not just personal but also relational. In this sense, waiting becomes a way to draw closer to others and to grow together in faith. The theme of waiting is not just a concept of patience, but also a test of the sincerity of our relationship with God. Lewis often wrote about how, as human beings, we tend to crave instant results, immediate answers, and fast solutions to our problems. It is an inherent part of our fallen nature to want to control situations and to expect things to happen according to our own timeline. However, the process of waiting challenges these desires. It confronts us with the reality that we do not have control over every aspect of our lives. In this way, waiting can serve as an invitation to trust more deeply in God's providence and His perfect wisdom. C.S. Lewis, in his reflection on waiting, suggests that often we are waiting for things that we think will bring us satisfaction. Whether it's the resolution of a particular problem, a prayer being answered, or a longing being fulfilled, we place much of our hope on the idea that if only this one thing were to happen, we would be at peace. But Lewis contends that the true satisfaction we seek cannot be found in the temporary circumstances of this world. In Mere Christianity, he writes, "If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, The most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. This longing for something more, something beyond the physical, the temporal, is a key aspect of the waiting experience. During these periods of waiting, we are often confronted with the emptiness of the things we thought would fulfill us. We realize that no earthly answer or material possession can truly satisfy the deep, inner yearning that we experience. This yearning, according to Lewis, points us toward the eternal. In waiting, we are not only learning to trust in God's timing, but we are also being reminded of our true home, a place where our deepest desires will be fully realized in God's presence. The waiting itself becomes a form of preparation, as it enables us to grow in spiritual maturity and develop the character necessary to experience the fullness of the joy God has in store for us. Lewis often spoke about the importance of the long obedience in the same direction, a concept that implies that spiritual growth and transformation happen over time through continuous faithfulness rather than through dramatic or instantaneous change. In this way, waiting is an essential part of the process of sanctification, where we are continually being shaped into the likeness of Christ moment by moment. Additionally, waiting brings about a deeper understanding of God's love. C.S. Lewis writes in The Four Loves about how love often involves sacrifice, a willingness to put the beloved's needs above one's own desires. Waiting, then, becomes an act of love. Not just love for God, but also a demonstration of love for others. When we wait patiently and trust God's timing, we acknowledge that His plans are good, not just for us, but for everyone around us. Lewis suggests that God's love is often revealed most clearly through our own surrender, through our willingness to trust Him when things are uncertain, uncomfortable, or when answers are delayed. This love, which might seem hidden or hard to understand in the midst of our waiting, is one that is deeply protective, transformative, and redemptive. It works in ways we may not always recognize, but its purpose is always aligned with God's greater plan. In his personal reflections, C.S. Lewis also acknowledges that the act of waiting is not always easy. It can be frustrating, painful, and filled with doubts. Lewis himself faced significant struggles in his life, including the death of his wife, Joy David Mann, and the wrestling with the deep pain of grief. In A Grief Observed, Lewis writes about the anguish he experienced after her passing. The waiting, in this case, was not for something external, but for an emotional resolution, for a sense of peace and understanding. He writes, "I need Christ, not something that resembles Him. I need the real Him." Here, Lewis touches upon the painful but necessary aspect of waiting. The search for truth, the search for God's presence, especially in moments of deep personal loss or uncertainty. In times of personal loss or sorrow, waiting can feel unbearable. The answer we so desperately seek may not be coming when we want it, and the hope we cling to seems far off. But in the midst of such grief, Lewis offers profound wisdom. It is precisely in these moments that our faith is being refined. Waiting is not only about receiving an answer. It is about becoming more attuned to God's presence in our lives, particularly when things seem bleak. This is the place where God's love often meets us most intimately, right in the midst of our pain, confusion, and longing. Through waiting, we discover that God's love is not dependent on our circumstances, but is ever-present, always faithful. One of the most profound insights Lewis offers on waiting is the idea that God uses waiting as an opportunity for spiritual growth. It is during these times of stillness, when we have no other option but to wait, that God can work most effectively in our hearts. Waiting has the potential to bring about a deeper level of self-awareness and self-surrender. It forces us to confront the parts of ourselves that are resistant to God's will and to allow Him to transform those areas. Lewis often speaks of how God works in unexpected ways, and waiting is one of those ways. It is during the times of waiting that we are reminded of our dependence on God. In our rush to have everything resolved, we often forget that God does not exist to serve our immediate needs. We exist to glorify Him. And this is something that can only be fully realized through a life that waits on Him. Waiting is a sign of our trust in God's sovereignty, acknowledging that He knows what is best for us, even when we do not understand the reasons behind the delay. Moreover, waiting can cultivate within us a deeper empathy for others. As we endure periods of waiting in our own lives, we are more likely to recognize and understand the struggles of others who are waiting as well. C.S. Lewis, in his reflections on human nature, often emphasizes the importance of community and how we are called to bear one another's burdens. Waiting in this context can become a communal experience. It is not a time to isolate ourselves, but an opportunity to grow together, to pray with one another, and to support each other in our common struggle. In waiting, we learn to walk alongside others, offering them the comfort and support that we ourselves are receiving from God. While the experience of waiting may be long, difficult, and sometimes even unbearable, it is also a profound and significant aspect of the Christian journey. Through waiting, we grow in patience, in trust, and in understanding of God's ultimate plan for our lives. It is a reminder that we are not in control, but that God is always at work, both in us and in the world around us. And though we may not see the fruits of our waiting immediately, we can be assured that they will come, just as God has promised in His perfect timing. In conclusion, the insights that C.S. Lewis provides on waiting are a gift to anyone who is in a season of uncertainty, longing, or delay. His understanding of waiting as a time of spiritual formation, a deepening of trust, and an invitation to experience God's love more intimately offers hope in the midst of difficult circumstances. By learning to wait patiently, we align ourselves with God's purposes, grow in our relationship with Him, and find comfort in knowing that He is always faithful, even when His timing is not what we expect. As Lewis writes in Mere Christianity, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pains. In our waiting, we hear God's voice more clearly than ever before, and in that waiting, we find the deepest joy and fulfillment that only He can give. When we explore the idea of waiting from C.S. Lewis' perspective, we see that the act of waiting is far from passive. It's an active exercise in faith. It's in the waiting that we confront our deepest fears, our doubts, and our misconceptions about God. We are tempted to believe that God has forgotten us, or that He is indifferent to our pain. But Lewis reminds us that these feelings do not reflect the truth. In his book, The Problem of Pain, Lewis stresses that God's silence or apparent delay in answering prayers does not indicate his absence. Instead, these periods of waiting may be opportunities for a deeper engagement with God and a more profound experience of his love. Waiting teaches us to let go of the illusion that we can control everything. Lewis often reflected on the folly of thinking we can dictate the timing of events in our lives. In his personal life, he experienced many seasons of waiting. Waiting for recognition as an author, waiting for answers to his theological questions, and waiting for personal growth. He recognized that every time he faced a delay, a season of waiting, it was as though God was working behind the scenes, preparing him for something greater than he could have ever imagined. For Lewis, waiting was not just about receiving a particular answer or outcome, but about learning to accept God's perfect timing. In Mere Christianity, he speaks of how, as human beings, we often think that our own plans and timelines are the best. We tend to assume that we know what is good for us and that we should have everything we desire right now. However, he points out that God's plan for us is always better, even if it requires waiting. God is not simply concerned with our immediate comfort, but with our long-term well-being, our spiritual maturity, and our eternal purpose. Waiting, therefore, is part of the process of shaping us into the people we are meant to be. Know if you'd like to continue, adjust, or add other points.